This is episode 302 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by a special guest, a speaker at a Federalist Society event this week, Derek Muller, professor of law at University of Iowa. Go Hawkeyes. Welcome to the show, Derek.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you are talking, like I said, today at a Federalist Society event. That means that you are inherently somehow affiliated or acceptable enough to the Federalist Society, and presumably you know a fair amount about them. So why don't you describe what the Federalist Society is all about?
Sure. The Federalist Society is an organization of conservatives and libertarians, primarily designed to be thinking about the law, and that it's emphatically the province of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be, sustaining the separation of powers, and that it's essential to liberty, and thinking about legal and policy principles that would sort of sustain the values embodied in the Constitution. And so it's a network of legal professionals and law students all around the country, and they're interested in the free exchange of ideas and good debates and bringing some of these ideas to attorneys and the public around the country. So I'm pleased to speak today at the New Mexico Lawyers Chapter, where we'll meet over lunch and we'll talk about my specialty, election law, and I'm sure there'll be a robust exchange of ideas there.
That's a quiet area these days, election law. But before we get to that, who are maybe one or two of your judicial heroes? Rather than asking you which side of the judicial debate, conservative or libertarian, you fall on, I'll just ask you who you like, and we'll presume from there. So, who are your some of your heroes from a judicial perspective?
Do you have to say living or dead? Is there?
No, I don't think. I mean, if they're so obscure that nobody will know them if they're dead, you can describe them a little bit, but living would be ideal.
Well, I often prefer to pick the dead ones because it can be a little bit safer that way. I'll offer three dead ones with sort of a little history behind each of them. One is Justice Story, Justice Joseph Story was one of the early members of the Supreme Court. He wrote the commentaries on the Constitution, extremely important judicial theorist of the early 19th century, and really emphasizing, the sort of context in which the Constitution was written, the limitations of power, the sort of supremacy of the federal government over the states, and issued a number of really important decisions thinking about the role of the federal courts. So I always think about him. Another in the 20th century is Justice Jackson, who was his eloquence on the court in free speech matters, among others, was always really powerful. And he was one of the justices who actually dissented in the notorious Korematsu decision, where the Supreme Court approved President Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, something that the Supreme Court has now repudiated, but he was on sort of the right side of that issue. And then, most recently, I think about the late Justice Scalia. There are many justices on the court who I appreciate their work right now, but Justice Antonin Scalia's legacy from free speech and religion and the administrative state and the role of federal courts is still so significant and lasting, and we're still talking about these decisions many years after his death, and the court is still grappling with these things many years into the future, I think. So his legacy, I think, is significant, influential, and I think laudable.
Very nice. Well, the other two, I think they preceded my and your births on this planet, but Scalia came to Albuquerque one time pretty early on in my tenure at the Rio Grande Foundation, and he was definitely somebody who made some potentially dry legal issues very interesting and engaging. Agree with him, disagree with him, whether you think he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg should have been friends or not. He was an interesting and very funny guy. Yeah. So definitely right with you on that one. Now, you do election law, and that is an area that has really, I don't know, maybe not blown up all of a sudden, but it's definitely among the most interesting and controversial areas of the law currently. And I know you're going to be talking a little bit about the 2020 election and President Trump's challenges and some of what he's done before, after the election. And I want to talk to you about what's going on in Arizona right now. But kind of give me your elevator speech on that particular issue, the 2020 election.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were dealing with a lot of challenges in 2020, from the pandemic to a lot of just partisan fights between legislatures and executives, between extremely well-funded advocacy organizations funding litigation in the states, federal judges, state courts changing election rules. And so there was a lot of consternation over the 2020 election, just to put it mildly. So I think about, for the most part, I think states did a good job. There's things I don't necessarily agree with, things as a matter of policy I maybe wouldn't have implemented here and there. But I think there were sort of reasonable efforts, and especially in states that were trying to make up a lot of changes to their election rules and dealing with pandemic-related precautions at the last minute. They for the most part did a good job. And I know, I think for those of us who were disappointed with the outcome of the presidential election, we can still be disappointed maybe in the direction of the presidential election and think that, we did what we could on the legal side. I think the canvassing, the recounts, the audits that happened, all suggested that we ran a pretty clean, pretty strong election, and I think we should have confidence in that. And that's not a popular thing to say, and it can lose people like Liz Cheney her job when we talk about those kinds of things. And maybe I wouldn't come out and say it in such aggressive tones, but I think we should praise the local election officials when they did the best they could.
All right. Well, that definitely lays out a strong position and something that we have ample time to talk about here during this podcast. So, I'm no expert on these issues. I know where things are in New Mexico. Read the same news reports and try to ignore as best as possible the cable news talking heads because, that's a different subject for a different day. But definitely some states that stuck out as being questionable. May have been, Pennsylvania, possibly Arizona. Now, you said that by and large they did a good job, and I'm not challenging that, but I would say that certainly Pennsylvania seemed to be a state that had some issues. Is that one that you would point to, or what other states would you point to as ones that maybe not so good?
Yeah, so I think Pennsylvania is a great example. So Pennsylvania had a lot of changes made their election laws, and a lot of it was friction between the legislature and the governor in particular, right? Governor initiates regulations, lockdowns, whatever it might be. Secretary of State sort of strongly presses for expanded absentee voting. Counties in Pennsylvania have a lot of local governance and a lot of control. So different counties are doing different things, and probably to no surprise, Democratic-controlled counties are doing some different things than Republican-controlled counties, more aggressively mailing out absentee ballot applications, absentee ballots. And then when it comes to, the counting, large cities or large counties like Philadelphia undoubtedly take longer, and we can sort of wonder about whether or not they're as well run as some of the other counties, or maybe it's that they're not as well funded. So there were a lot of challenges that arose. And so I'll sort of point out to a couple different things that were challenging. On the one side, Republicans really strongly opposed the opportunity to process ballots before Election Day. And what that meant was in states like Florida, they've been processing them for weeks. So when we get to Election Day, we pretty much know all the ballots that are there. Whereas in Pennsylvania, they couldn't start processing ballots until Election Day. And so in the days that follow, they were ripping open envelopes and running them through machines. And people viewed that with some skepticism. And so had they been
Hold on right there.
Yeah.
Sorry. You said Republicans oppose processing before Election Day. But just to be clear, Florida is a Republican state, top down.
Yes.
I don't know about their Secretary of State. Sorry, that's beyond the purview. Florida definitely has a Republican governor,
Right.
Republican legislature. Pennsylvania, I know, had a Democratic
Yes.
governor.
Yeah.
I presume a Democrat Secretary of State.
Yes.
But a Republican controlled legislature.
Right.
So, but nonetheless, even with that partisan breakdown, you're saying Florida was processing, mail-in, early voting, I assume,
Right.
Beforehand, but Pennsylvania was not.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania couldn't because the Republican legislature wouldn't approve that, right?
But Florida's did?
Florida has. Florida's been doing it for a long time.
Probably
right?
since 2000?
Probably since 2000, right? Republicans had one point, which is, sometimes, this happened in Michigan, actually. We can change... Sometimes voters want to change their ballot, and they want to show up, a week before the election and say, "Hey, I know I mailed in my ballot, but can I change that? Can I give a new ballot, and I want to update it? And then you've got the old ballot, which I haven't opened the envelope on. I can destroy that and count the new one." So there's like trade-offs we make. But
I say no. That's just my personal.
That's fine. So Republicans didn't want that in Pennsylvania. Again, that's fine. Like if you don't want to process the ballots early. But then there should be nothing suspicious. Like we had tons of absentee voting, like all around the country. So there's nothing really suspicious that on Wednesday and Thursday they're still ripping open envelopes to have to process them. So I think that we can look at that with and say, boy, that's sketchy that it took them so long to count. When in reality, like the rules were in place that made it difficult to count on election night, unlike places like Florida. Now let me offer a flip side to that, where there is, I think, some sketchy things that happen. So, but I think the Supreme Court helped here. So one is one of the most important lawsuits that was filed by the Republican Party of Pennsylvania, where there was a challenge to say, well, because of all these absentee ballots and because of voting by mail, Pennsylvania, the legislature picked a hard stop, saying ballots have to come in by Election Day. Many states have rules like that, right? We want to have a hard count. There can be additional fraud or uncertainty with ballots that sort of arrive in the mail after Election Day. We have a postmark, but not everything's postmarked. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, we're going to extend that deadline 3 days. And any ballots that come in that are postmarked by Election Day, or any ballots that come in that aren't postmarked, but that we don't have evidence suggests they were mailed after Election Day, we're going to count those ballots in the 3 days after the election. And that's not a great thing, I think. I mean, I understand that we have these sort of challenges of the pandemic, and we have lots of mail and ballots that are coming in. One of the important things that happened is the United States Supreme Court sort of said to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, listen, you can't institute this decision right now. You need to set aside any ballots that come in those 3 days, because the Constitution gives the state legislature the power to dictate the manner of holding elections. And when you step in and create a new rule on the eve of the election, we have a real problem about the notion that maybe the state Supreme Court is usurping the legislative power. But again, while I think there's a really strong case to be made that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did so, none of those ballots that arrived, about 10,000 ballots, none of those ballots were included in that canvas or in that total. The United States Supreme Court had effectively told the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, keep those ballots to the side, don't include them. And so while I think there was, a real problem with sort of the state court making up rules that the legislature didn't want, I think it certainly didn't affect the outcome, because we sort of segregated those ballots and kept them off to the side, and we didn't have to worry about whether or not the Pennsylvania Supreme Court or the Pennsylvania legislature rule controlled. The legislature's rule still controlled there.
All right. Now, Arizona is another state that whether the politicians and the courts had a role to play or how big their role was. Certainly, here's the narrative I kind of get from people is Fox News calls it, there's one vote in the till, and Fox News says it's going for Biden. That caused a lot of consternation with people on election. I was doing 3 hours straight of election coverage on NPR, which, by the way, it's a totally different ballgame from a commercial station, because NPR doesn't take breaks. So you almost need a catheter for that kind of election coverage. But I digress. So it did come across as somewhat surprising. There's obviously this, and you can describe. I'm not going to describe it correctly, but there is some kind of loosely based Trump-oriented recount going on. I don't know the details, and I hope you can share some on that. But it's going on right now. They say they are looking for problems, fraud, etc., in the election process there in Arizona. That wasn't one of the states that I thought, like Pennsylvania, there was these real issues with. But that doesn't mean that a really thorough audit and count couldn't come up with something. So fill in the gaps. What am I missing? What's going on in Arizona right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, we start with Fox News on election night. I mean, they got lucky. I mean, they called it way too early, in my judgment, and I know they stuck by it, but they were very fortunate that I think their call was right at the end of the day. And there's a reason no other news organizations did so. Like, all of their numbers suggested you needed to wait a few more days before it came in. So that was, but you're right, caused a lot of consternation when that happened. Yeah, but otherwise, I think, there's a sense that people have, like they say, oh, how could Arizona vote for Joe Biden? Like, the people have this sort of notion that states are, I don't know, they're like one thing, like that Arizona's Republican. And I sit there and I look at Arizona, I said, like, the last two Republican senators to represent Arizona are Jeff Flake and John McCain, which are not, they're not like your hard right conservatives, right? They're something else.
Well, having been in Washington and worked with Jeff Flake, I mean, I would have described him circa 2003, 4, 5 as a very fiscal, hawkish kind of guy, and a relatively socially moderate kind of guy. He was kind of a proto Justin Amash or something. I mean, he evolved dramatically, I think, generally to the left. But your statement is clear. Being here in the Southwest with Arizona, they've always been well to the right, much more of a red state than New Mexico has. But a lot of these states in the Rocky Mountain West are changing. I mean, New Mexico's been so blue for so long, it really isn't. We welcome the Californians because you never know, they might tilt us to the right. But Arizona, the assumption is that it's just this influx of Arizonans, of Californians that are shifting the politics of that state leftward. So maybe that's not the case, but anyway, you're right. Arizona is much more of a swing state than it used to be.
I mean, it had Governor Janet Napolitano, who is, for an extended period of time, who is certainly no friend of conservatives. So
I'd rather have Judge Napolitano, but hey,
So I think about that, right? There's no question that it's a pretty conservative state, but it has some Democratic leanings.
Yeah.
So something about that component.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about, what kinds of skepticism you might have about the result, right? And I always come back to, like, what is your evidence? And I think that is the most important question to ask. It can't just be a gut check. It can't just be I saw more yard signs. The fundamentals of Arizona point in a single direction. Like, what's the evidence there?
You mean Trump having bigger rallies around the country isn't enough of a measuring stick?
Sadly, no. So
Ron Paul would be president, by the way,
that's right,
if that was
that's
the
right.
case. I mean, I'm sufficiently old and Ron Paulian to know that he had the biggest rallies, the most rabid social media following, all that stuff back in 08 and 12.
Yeah. So just to think, especially for the listeners out there, if you wanted to steal a vote, let's just pick one vote. You wanted to steal a ballot. How would you do it? I think people need to sort of walk their minds through, like, what that's going to happen. The first is, like, ballots are very carefully accounted for. They're printed by specific vendors that deliver them with a specific sort of guidance and oversight to them. So you get a pallet of 10,000 ballots and that the county recorder or whatever has and keeps in custody and counts and makes sure they have, and then they hand it out to the vote centers and so on. And then they hand out those vote centers or precincts. And then on election day, I mean, we can pick election day, but it's a similar process for absentee voting. When you show up, and it depends on your state, but you show up and you sign in. It could be an electronic poll book. You might have to show an ID, whatever it might be. And they say, okay, Derek Muller, he's showed up here in the right place. He's asking for a ballot. And then you request a ballot. They give you a ballot. You go, you fill it out, you drop it in the ballot box. The ballot box sort of records that and registers it at the end of the night, and then you walk away, right? And actually, just that process right there, we've actually created 3 records of your ballot. We've said now we can go to the end of the night when we reconcile everything. When the poll workers close down the station, they're going to look in the poll book and they're going to say we had 737 people who said they came in and signed into our system. And then they're going to look at the paper ballots and they're going to say we have 737 paper ballots here at the end of the night. And then they're going to look at the machine that sort of took those ballots and ran through the machine, and they're going to say the print total has 737 ballots that ran through this machine. So we've already got 3 different records you have to get through to say, like, this is the total out of this precinct. So, and then at the end of the night, if they gave your station 1,000 ballots, they have to account for that. They say, well, we had 737 people cast votes. We had 2 provisional ballots over here. There were 6 spoiled ballots, people who voted but then wanted to change their mind, so we destroyed it and gave them a new ballot, and then here's all the ballots that are unused. And those have to be accounted for and reconciled and given back to the county, to the Secretary of State. And then as the process goes along, the canvass happens between those unofficial results on election night. They always say unofficial on the bottom on the Fox News scroll, right? And in the canvass, they sort of double and triple check these things. And they go through and they say, well, wait a minute, this says 738. Why do you say 737? Or how do we account for this discrepancy? And so we have to account for these things as the process goes on. And so there are like a number of checks in the process. So if you wanted to steal one ballot, let's say, and drop it in somewhere, first you have to get access to it. And then, they're going to look at the poll books and they're going to say, well, why do we have 737 people, but 738 ballots drop in the ballot box? So we want to be thinking about those kinds of questions. So all that is a long way of saying we have a lot of safeguards in the process. And I think it's important that we do conduct regular checks and audits and so on. But we need to be careful to think that there's a lot of existing safeguards in the process and a lot of steps and hurdles you'd have to surmount to steal even one ballot. Doing it at scale, thousands, tens of thousands. I mean, when you think about trying to do that, it's going to be much, much harder.
So, kind of summarize Arizona. You don't think there were serious issues. Now, what is happening right now? Can you do you know? Can you describe it?
So it's a little bit tougher right now. So the Arizona legislature is doing a kind of audit. And I say a kind of audit because usually what happens when we use the term audit in the election law sense, usually it means in late November. The counties have ways of double and triple checking. They'll do things like, let's pick a precinct at random and hand count it and like verify that everything's good. Or we also have audits where we say, let's run all these numbers and do a sort of a balancing of the accounting sheets at the end of the day. So there's some like things built into the statutes that specifically mean how we audit these elections. The legislature, though, they kind of just said, give us all the ballots, Maricopa County. They only pick one county. They say, give us all your ballots. And then they said, we're going to look for stuff. So it's a little freewheeling, is I think also the concern. They've hired a consulting firm, Cyber Ninjas, to take a look at the paper that's being used.
Cyber Ninjas? Oh, man.
If you could brand yourself, right? Why not?
Yeah, that's good marketing right there.
They're looking at the paper to make sure the paper was appropriate and there were no fraudulent ballots being used. But it's also not clear. Again, I was involved in a recount in Iowa this past year. And when we're given a recount, we have a manual that tells us how to do the recount. We have a 3-member board consisting of 1 member of the winning candidate, 1 member of the contesting candidate, and a 3rd neutral candidate. We sort of walk through every single ballot and come to a consensus as a group. So, we have some procedures put in place. Again, I think one of the concerns coming out of Arizona is those procedures that they're showing a lot of things on video about walking through the ballots, but it's not clear to me up front what that process looks like. If you say we're looking for funny stuff, let me just say, Paul, they're going to find funny stuff. I mean, I hate to...
Maybe someone who played Connect the Dots and like drew a picture or something, like some of those tests people took in high school.
There's a little bit of fraud that happens in every election, right? Mm-hmm. There are people who cast votes for their dead spouse. There's a little bit of fraud that happens all the time. There are mistakes made all the time. Like when you're dealing with 100,000 sheets of paper, 100 million sheets of paper across the United States, there's going to be some screw ups. Like it just happens. So I think there's no question we're going to see some strange stuff. I think the prevailing question is there's systemic problems, right? Is there some suggestion that the poll workers were fraudulently and regularly miscasting ballots where they doing inappropriate things on an extensive basis, suggesting that there were tens of thousands of ineligible voters who suddenly showed up, tens of thousands of ballots that were blank, that were fraudulently filled out and slipped into the system. And in my judgment, that is extraordinarily difficult to achieve as one of the greatest heists that would ever occur in the contemporary American system. I mean, this ain't Chicago in 1900 where, you can find your union boys to sort of hand out ballots to people to sort of go in, right? I mean, there's just a lot more safeguards in the process.
It's not Chicago in, 1960?
60 works too.
Yeah. I mean, 1900 is fine, but 1960, at least there's a lot of people still alive from who can remember that. And anyway, okay, so you're expecting that there would be some minor issues, but nothing that would qualify as widespread fraud or some kind of systemic issue there in Arizona. Okay, that's definitely fair. Now, kind of taking off your lawyerly hat and putting on a more policy-oriented hat, because obviously this was a very unique election due to COVID-19. But generally New Mexico, as we've talked about, it's a blue state. Democrats have controlled election policies by and large. And plus, a lot of this is all being hashed out in different states, Georgia, Florida. I know other states are enacting election laws. Are there reforms to the system that you do think would be helpful and necessary? Are there reforms that are just not worth the time and effort? Where do you kind of fall down in terms of various aspects of the system that could be shored up or don't really need to be addressed at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I feel like in some ways these debates feel like two bald men fighting over a comb. Like there's a lot of
hey. Let's not go
present
there.
company excluded. I mean, like Democrats are constantly complaining about voter suppression, and like we had one of the largest turnouts in American history in the middle of a pandemic. We say, well, it's attributable to all the absentee balloting, but it's not just that. There were huge Republican surges even in places where there's in-person voting, and lots of Republicans were worried about fraud. And you look out there, and there's maybe a couple dozen prosecutions happening around the country. And, Bill Barr, who was a real warrior in the Trump Department of Justice, we haven't found anything in terms of the kind of fraud we're expecting. So in some ways, a lot of this is really to placate partisans rather than dealing with sort of any systemic issues. The one thing, though, that I do think about is I do think it undermines a little bit of confidence in the system if local officials are just doing different things, right? If your county official or your local official is doing one thing and in the next county they're doing something else, then in your county they're mailing everyone an absentee ballot, and in the next county they're not. They're pre-filling out forms, another one they're not. The signature matching looks like this in this county and it looks like that in another county. And, I'm not sure what the best policies are, and it might vary from state to state depending on the population or depending on the partisanship or the interest in the state. But I do think we should be coming up with more policies that if it's a statewide presidential election, like the rules should look the same. It shouldn't matter if you're in Albuquerque or Santa Fe or Los Alamos or Alamogordo or wherever. Like pick a policy and have it apply uniformly. And I know that takes away some of the discretion and locality. We can talk about the conservative values about local jurisdictions making local judgments. But I think there's also a value of consistency of treatment of the voters, like regardless of where you are. And so I want to be thinking about those components too going forward. So in some ways, some of these measures in places like Texas, Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, they're trying to provide some more uniform standards. Here's where drop box locations are. Here's the deadlines and timing that everyone starts the same. But I think those are good things to provide that consistency of treatment across jurisdictions.
So I guess we can definitively say that Georgia's election law was not Jim Eagle, I believe, whatever, Jim Crow on steroids. Pick your absurd metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, you have to read the text of Georgia's law, which a lot of people aren't doing. And a lot of people are mischaracterizing it. Now, let me say, there are some parts that are a little more inexplicable to me. One of them being banning giving bottles of water to people waiting in line. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe your vote can be bought with a bottle of water, Paul. I'm not sure. But I'm not sure how much bribery is happening at the polling place for people getting water. So there were some unforced errors. But there's, a couple other things. I think the Biden administration really came out saying, oh, they cut back on voting, early voting hours to working hours 9 to 5. Well, the old law said working hours. The new law replaces that text with 9 to 5. And in the discretion of the local community, it can be up to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So when you take an ambiguous statute like 9 to 5 and work it over to, or ambiguous statute like working day over to 9 to 5, or work business hours to 9 to 5, it's really just clarifying the statute. And for people to get upset or angry about that is really absurd. Another thing is the statute actually requires early voting on multiple Saturdays in every county, which not every county had offered before. So it actually offers some increased early voting opportunities. The one thing, it's gotten a little bit of attention. The one thing that's more concerning, I think, is after this, there was a full recount in Georgia. There was an audit. There were a lot of double checks and triple checks in Georgia. And they found some stuff. Donald Trump picked up several hundred votes in the recount. It wasn't enough to get him over the hump, but he made up some ground. And election officials approved that. Republican election officials approved those results. I think one of the things to be concerned about is the legislature taking away some of that power from the local officials, from the elected officials, and giving it potentially the legislature to step in and change or deny the canvass or perhaps alter the outcome. And this is a little worrisome because I know, everyone who's in power right now, they think we're going to be in power forever, right? Republicans in the Georgia legislature think, oh, we're never going to lose power in the legislature. So we want our people in there to sort of pick things. But, I don't know. If Democrats are in control of the legislature and they have more oversight of the election process, that probably is going to upset a lot of Republicans. So I think this change in oversight is also something that's going to be interesting to watch going forward, coming out of Georgia and perhaps other places.
So, mail-in election voting, purging of the voter rolls. I don't know. There's other issues. Voter ID.
Yeah.
These are considered in your kind of viewpoints to be relatively minor factors, or would you say that any of them should be done more religiously, less so?
No, I mean, again, maybe I'm a true conservative in the sense I'm thinking about the federalism aspects, like letting some of these states experiment, right? I think about voter ID laws. I don't know how much fraud they prevent. I don't know how much suppression that occurs. And in fact, I would say probably very little. And a lot of plaintiffs have lost a lot of lawsuits on these voter ID laws because they're very generous. In terms of absentee voting, it was strange. I feel like it was crossing with the pandemic a little bit in 2020. Absentee voting has been very popular with Republicans for a long time. It was Ronald Reagan who signed the Uniformed Overseas Voter and Absentee Voter Act, UOCAVA as it's called, and I'm never going to get the acronym right, to expand absentee voting for military voters, right? Because that's a major opportunity for Republicans and senior citizens who often have the most difficulty of getting to the polls. They're the ones who we think about absentee voting. And yet in 2020, it became this fight about Democrats who said, it was deadly to ever step outside. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Deadly to step outside your home. You couldn't go to the polling place. Everyone needed an absentee ballot in hand. And Republicans who wanted to say, no, it's perfectly safe to go to the polling place on election day. Don't cast an absentee ballot. Show up in person and cast on election day and sort of be there, be physically present. It's safe to do so. So for some reason, there was this huge partisan divide on the absentee voter issue. Florida's had very generous absentee voters, again, coming back to 2000 and Jeb Bush, very generous absentee voter provisions for a very long time. So I'm just not sure. I think there is a case to be made that, we want people to vote on election day when they all have the same information. It's sort of a civic opportunity to sort of all arrive at the same place. there are fewer opportunities for fraud. Absentee has a little bit more opportunity for fraud. It's a little bit easier to verify voters' identity. There's a little bit less chance for corruption. So, maybe there's a reason to press it in that direction. And I think some of the reforms that Republicans have proposed are sort of nudging people back into the sort of showing up on election day front. But to be frank, I'm not sure that absentee voting is particularly helpful or harmful to one party or another. People who want to vote are going to go out and vote, and to the extent there are more opportunities, they're going to pick the ones that are the most convenient.
All right. Well, I think that is a pretty thorough discussion there of election law issues. And I guess to summarize, you don't think that the President Trump, of course, necessarily proved a case for election fraud, or that the system needs to be changed in some unspecified way, because the next thing I'm going to ask you is about federal law that is being pushed. So let's just put a cap on this aspect, though. You don't think Trump was defrauded of the election or any of that stuff?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So now we're, we haven't really discussed the federal law, but I'll let you describe some aspects of it, because it's obviously both about the mechanics of voting. It is also about organizations like the Rio Grande Foundation and our donations and the privacy thereof. Now, before I let you describe more details about the law, is it your assessment? Say that somehow the filibuster went by the wayside and Democrats had like a clear shot to pass this law. Do you think they would? Do you think they would do it? Do you think this is something that they actually want to do policy-wise, or is this, for lack of a better word, virtue signaling on the left? There's virtue signaling on both sides, or signaling at least?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great question. So HR 1 was introduced in 2019, right? People kind of think about this as somehow some response to Trump today. Like that's all made up, right? They proposed this as a virtue signaling device in 2019. They knew President Trump would veto the bill if it ever got to his desk, right. And it certainly wasn't going to make it through the Senate. So there is an aspect of that, and there's a lot of people who have signed on to it who are privately admitting there's like lots of problems in the bill, and certainly some components that might be unconstitutional. So no, I think that many of them, however, are convinced there's a lot of things in the bill they're not from 2019. They're from the 70s. I mean, there's a lot of like a liberal wish list in there. I think that many Democrats would be very happy to see enacted.
Okay. So let's talk about the bill itself. Yeah. You mentioned it's HR 1. So just by that, you send up red flags, because that is, a new Congress convenes. Of course, it's under the control of Democrats. The first bill always is an important bill, a top priority bill. What would it do? Summarize the myriad provisions that are contained in this bill.
You want me to summarize an 886-page bill?
Yeah, just a minute. 30 seconds if you're really feeling frisky.
I mean, so it does a lot of things. I mean, it requires some extended absentee voting and early voting. It essentially prohibits some kinds of voter ID laws from being used. It would enfranchise ex-felons throughout the United States. It would require independent redistricting commissions to prevent partisan gerrymandering in legislative elections. It has a number of disclosure provisions of requiring disclosure of contributions and identity of advertisers for political advertisements. It would turn the Federal Election Commission, which is right now a 6-member commission, so it takes 4 members, which usually requires bipartisan support to do anything. It would move it to a 5-member commission, which would allow 3 out of 5, which could all be controlled by one party to get anything done. So it's sort of a sprawling. I mean, it has some,
and it bans voter ID, I believe.
Yes.
So I mean, not that that's the be all end all, but there are, like you said, it's a very ambitious piece of legislation, very complicated, and like I said, as long as Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin in the Senate oppose those kinds of issues. And by the way, you are in probably one of the few, if not the only, congressional districts in the entire country that is in the midst of a special election right now. So we're in process replacing Deb Haaland, Secretary of the Interior. Of course, the electoral process is happening as we speak right now with early voting. So just a quick aside, but that could have some impact because the numbers are extremely tight in both the Senate and the House. But broadly and in principle, this takes this 50-state process that we've had. I assume this was something that loosely grew up in the wake of the Constitution, and it's been with us for over 200 years, and turns it into a federally controlled and operated process. We've got a few minutes to go, but explain the philosophical underpinnings of those two different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, if you go back, we opened this, a member of the Federalist Society, I'll be presenting the Federalist Society. One of the great anti-federalist critiques of the Constitution was saying this elections clause gives too much power to Congress. Because what the Constitution says about elections, federal elections at least, especially congressional elections, is that federal elections are principally run by the states. States come up with the rules. But Congress can always step in whenever it wants and develop its own rules. But it's been very reluctant to do so for a very long time. And I think it's done so in a few places. So the National Voter Registration Act, motor voter, right? I mean, you and I are probably too young to remember the days where the DMV didn't have voter registration at their place, right? It's sort of a commonplace thing now. That was by a federal mandate. In 2002, the Help America Vote Act, after the 2000 election, helped phase out punch card voting and other kinds of things because it recognized we needed to provide a little bit of uniform federal standards. So there have been these opportunities, but I think we'd say these are fairly minor, right? I mean, they might be large in some respects in the areas where they're moving, but compared to everything else, most of this is still run at the state level. So for a lot of these measures, we can set aside maybe the campaign finance provisions, which are really run at the federal level. For a lot of these other things, it really would provide many more sort of nuts and bolts regulations at the federal level and usurp a lot more state authority. And that just, it's a policy judgment. If you think those are great rules, and a lot of Democrats think no voter ID, unlimited ballot harvesting, extensive early voting, and absentee voting are great things, then it's a great thing. If you think, there might be some situations where we want to limit or restrict those things, or we want to put more conditions on them, we think it's bad if, your employer collects your ballot, or we think that there's pressure on those kinds of things. If we think that those kinds of rules or regulations should be in place at certain state levels, then I think HR 1 becomes a much more difficult pill to swallow.
All right. Well, I think those are some of the big issues, and I look forward to listening to more of your presentation and your views at lunch. But if people want to find out more about you, your work, follow you on Twitter, for example, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, my Twitter is Derek T. Muller, but I'm a little off that right now because my goal is to have some downtime after the election. So I'll get back active on there. But I do have a blog called excessofdemocracy.com. Which is a phrase that Elbridge Gerry used at the founding during the constitutional debates. And when a lot of people were talking about all these sorts of ideas about democracy, one of the things that he said, he was the governor of Massachusetts and later James Madison's vice president. He had just experienced a populist uprising in Massachusetts and said, actually, we have, some of the problems here are not that people don't have the chance to vote. In some ways, they're voting too much, and the mob can get unruly, and that's a check we have to have. So I named my blog Excess of Democracy to think, thinking about checks on democracy are also a good thing to think about separation of powers, about limited government, and those kinds of principles that can be constraining just whatever the mob wants. So that's my blog where I talk about election law issues, but also sometimes legal education, federal courts, and other related topics.
Okay, I can't leave an Elbridge Gerry reference without. Now, first and foremost, am I wrong that he signed both the Declaration and the Constitution?
So he signed the Declaration, and then he walked away from the Constitution. He was one of a handful of people. He was there the whole time, and he walked away because he thought it provided for too strong a federal government.
Okay. Good man. And then, of course, his name lives on to this day. Of course, we probably referenced it a couple times. It's taken on a soft G gerrymander as opposed to, some in the know, the lawyerly crowd, they'll call it a gerrymander. But anyway, that term, I don't know. You can maybe quickly relate that story.
Yeah, I mean, well, he was the governor when the Federalists they were somewhat the Federal when his party redrew the maps, and he was the governor at the time where he approved it. And one of those maps, one of the local papers said, they drew a political cartoon and said it looked like a salamander, and so they critiqued it as Elbridge Gerry's salamander. So we get this sort of, dragon cartoonish shape that has taken on a life of its own today, and the word gerrymander has stuck. So it's also funny today, briefly, people critique gerrymandering. Oh, gerrymandering's the worst thing ever. It's like, this thing is old. Like, this is not a problem in the last 10 years that Republicans invented. It's been around for a very long time.
You got it. All right. Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at Tipping Point, New Mexico, tippingpointnm.com, or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.